The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm your host, Rosie Blore. Every weekday we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world. Sudan is the world's largest conflict, now enveloped in multiple wars. Today we bring you the story of one survivor and ask who, if anyone, might be able to help bring peace to this forgotten country. And stray dogs are a feature of life in Turkey. Now a new law aims to clean up the streets. Our correspondent visited an animal clinic to see how it and other shelters might cope with the influx. First up, though, for the past 2 nights, Russia has been pounding Ukrainian cities. The missile attacks are aimed at civilian buildings, as well as damaging Ukraine's energy grid as it heads into autumn. To try and stop the incoming missiles, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine hopes to use newly acquired F-16 fighters in the southern stretches of Russia. It has already been a long war. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Western countries applied sanctions aimed at stopping exports to Russia of any technology that could be used in weapons. But over 2 years on, Russia seems to have adapted to the sanctions. It is still managing to replenish its armaments, and its economy is growing at about 4% a year. So why are sanctions doing so little to stop the Russian offensive?
Sanctions are the West's main weapon in this war against Russia. It's the only way that politicians have of helping Ukraine other than military aid.
Kerryn Richmond-Jones is The Economist international economics correspondent.
But there's a huge problem 2 years in. Russia's economy is doing really well, and it doesn't look like it's deprived of that many goods. So we really have to ask, what on earth is going on, and why aren't sanctions working?
So just remind us quickly what sanctions the West actually took out against Russia.
So the EU has adopted 14 packages of sanctions since the war in Ukraine began. The most recent of those was in June. And that makes this the biggest economic war since the Second World War. There are 2 forms of sanctions. The first is bans on goods. So more or less anything that Russia could use on a battlefield, it's forbidden now to export from Europe into Russia. And that ranges from the very, very sensible, so drones, microelectronics, ammunition, but also to the kind of more offbeat. So it's illegal to import a microwave oven or a ball bearing into Russia from Europe. And that's because policymakers are just dead scared that anything could end up in a Russian tank. The second type of sanction is a financial sanction, and that basically bans banks in Europe from transacting with any state-owned firm in Russia, any firm or person that has connection to Russia's economy, or most of Russia's richest people and businesses. So really that's the majority of the Russian banking system. Major Russian banks are locked out of SWIFT. That's the network that banks use to talk to each other, and it's based in Belgium. So it's an incredibly sophisticated regime.
That all sounds pretty comprehensive. So how has the Russian economy managed to grow?
The clue is in all the other places that Russia can get what it used to get from Europe. So let's take the tech industry as a good example. Russia now imports far less tech from Europe than it did before the war. At the same time, Russia started importing an incredible amount from Kazakhstan. So in 2021, Russia got about $40 million worth of electronics from Kazakhstan. By 2023, that had increased 7-fold. So maybe Russia's just getting its tech from different places, right? There's nothing that sanctions can do to stop that. But the story really isn't quite that simple. So Kazakhstan's tech industry in 2021, before the war, had just 50 firms, and they could churn out about $100 million worth of kind of stuff, household appliances, a few microelectronics a year. And actually, it seems that where most of the growth has come from is Kazakhstan importing from Europe. So it's importing components from Europe and then kind of shipping, repackaging, changing them in some way. And then they're going back out to Russia. So at that point, you really have to ask, are sanctions working, or is it just a more circuitous trade route?
And presumably Kazakhstan isn't the only country doing this.
Absolutely not. So kind of you're looking at more or less anything sandwiched in between Russia and Europe. That is Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, which we've seen kind of playing a two-sided foreign policy much more in the last couple of years, as well as the 4 other countries of Central Asia, the stans, as we would call them. In each, exports from the European Union to these countries has increased massively. So the total figure is about 50% since 2021, roughly equivalent to 3/4 of the drop from Europe's exports directly into Russia. And the other thing that has increased for all of them is exports out the other side from their countries into Russia. So you can kind of see what's going on. And really what's most worrying for policymakers is that the biggest growth in exports from the EU to these places is in the most heavily restricted product groups, things like chemicals, electronics and machinery.
So we can very directly see that this is sanctions busting then. I'm interested in that list of countries. A lot of them are allies with Russia, but not all of them. Something like Georgia is definitely not. Why would they act as a conduit?
This is complicated. The very straightforward and really big answer is that it's incredibly profitable for them to do so. Central Asia is currently in the middle of its most economically promising period in the last 20 years, and that is more or less directly down to all this intermediated trade going on. But the second and probably more revealing answer is that it's actually very difficult to tell what's coming in and out of Russia. So Georgia is going to want extra business from Europe. It thinks it's just getting extra business from Europe. And at some point, all these goods get kind of lost or remade, and it's tricky to tell then exactly what's coming out the other end to Russia.
It sounds like sanctions aren't working. Is there anything the West can actually do to try and close these routes?
Absolutely. So it's something that we've seen policymakers become more and more desperate to do in the last few months. At first, there was a huge focus on just putting more sanctions on, kind of heaping it up and hoping that you were plugging the leaks by adding extra restrictions. That, in the last few months, it has become clear is not working. So more than half of the battlefield equipment that Russia acquired from February to August 2022 contained components made in Europe or America. So now the focus has shifted in the US and in Europe. There are 2 things that policymakers can do. The first is it can put on secondary sanctions. We saw Joe Biden come out last year and say that it was more than possible that America might sanction entire financial institutions in places like Turkey or Kazakhstan if they were doing business with banks that were on America's blacklist. The problem with that is that you have to cut off entire arms of your trading system in order to be absolutely sure that it's working. So you would begin to see situations where Europe banned the export of ball bearings, not just to Russia, but to Kazakhstan, Turkey, Central Asia. That is difficult to do with the delicacy of Europe's allies. The second option is a charm offensive. That's what we're seeing in Armenia. The EU has offered this huge financial package to Armenia that's worth about 270 million euros. So that comes in the form of aid, preferential trade agreements, and even getting Armenia a little bit closer to EU membership, which is kind of what politicians are after. And the hope is that will encourage Armenia's government to crack down on trade going out to Russia. So the European policymakers won't have to do any of the tricky work of secondary sanctions, but you can't pursue both of those at once.
If supply chains are so difficult to follow, so difficult to see all the threads, does that erode our ability ever to really curtail activity in another country by these means?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think this is something that policymakers are really beginning to grapple with 2 years in. And what we've seen is that this is an almost unprecedented level of economic war, and it had just been assumed that it would work. And what we're finding now, particularly in Europe, is that although sanctions have got infinitely more intense and policymakers are infinitely more willing to chuck the kitchen sink against Russia than they were 10 years ago, The global economy has also changed and it's fragmenting. There's this new rise for third countries, places not only like Central Asia and Turkey, but also Indonesia, India, that just make these systems incredibly leaky. And there's another trend that we're seeing in places like Brussels, and it's people saying, no matter what we do, sanctions are not going to replace good old-fashioned military support.
Kerry-Ann, thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
Lovely to have me on. Thank you.
To hear about another side to the war in Ukraine, do tune in to this week's Babbage, our science podcast out tomorrow, about how Ukraine is using acoustic technology to fight Russia. Subscribers have access already. If you aren't one, you should know by now what you've got to do. Search Economist Podcast Plus, pay up, listen to all our brilliant shows.
الضرب كان شديد بيتي ذاته كان جنب المعسكر بيفتح على المعسكر احتياطا المركزي.
Husna Abdul Kader is a mother of 5 who's been forced from her home 4 times in 16 months.
Tom Gardner is The Economist's Africa correspondent.
First, she fled gunshots in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. A week later, she escaped a volley of bullets aimed at the bus driving her out of the city.
قمنا جينا مشينا نحن في الأسهر قلنا الضرب يخف وبين 3 نرجع.
She went to a town in the east called Gadara for much of the past year, but she was pushed out by drone strikes. That sent her south to Sennar state. But armed men on motorbikes opened fire in the village where she was, so she fled again. Now, she says, she's left with nothing but her slippers and has fled as far as she can go to Port Sudan on the Red Sea. I visited Port Sudan in July, and as I walked through the town, I encountered stories like Husna's at almost every step.
Tom, it's a devastating story, and as you say, she's one of so many. Tell me what the scale is of this conflict and how many people have been affected.
Yeah, it's sort of hard to comprehend the sheer scale of this conflict. I mean, since the war began last year, more than 20% of the country's pre-war population of roughly 50 million have been uprooted. Many to neighboring countries such as Egypt, but the vast majority of Sudanese remain inside Sudan. In fact, the UN estimates that as many as 1 in 7 internal refugees globally is Sudanese. For this reason and many others, the conflict in Sudan has a strong claim to being the largest and most devastating anywhere in the world today. Nobody knows quite how many people have been killed. One of the most widely cited estimates is 150,000, but that could be too low still. And it includes the targeted killings of Black Africans in Darfur in the far west, which has been credibly described by rights groups as genocide.
Tom, you spoke incredibly movingly about the conflict in Sudan on your recent episode of the Weekend Intelligence. But just briefly remind listeners now why it's happening.
So without going into the deep history, which, as you've said, we covered on our weekend show, in essence, the war began in April last year as a battle for supremacy between the National Army, headed by Sudan's de facto president, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and on the other side, a paramilitary force, a rival army in effect, called the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, which is commanded by a Darfuri warlord called Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hamiti. In the past year, the war has metastasized. It began basically confined to Khartoum and also to Darfur, this region in the far west, about the size of France. Now it is essentially multiple wars at once. The SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, is surrounded by a host of Islamist militias and civilian defense units who've taken up arms in the past year. And then the RSF, too, is orbited by a range of foreign mercenaries from neighboring countries, as well as Arab tribal militias, mostly from Darfur. Both sides blockade and terrorize civilians, but the RSF, the one accused of genocide in Darfur, have been making the most rapid advances across the country and causing destruction in their wake.
So who's in charge now?
Well, that's a good question. The Sudanese Armed Forces have declared themselves the legitimate authority, but they have been booted out of Khartoum, so have decamped now to Port Sudan on the Red Sea. The RSF controls most of Khartoum these days, most of Darfur, its home region, and much of the country in between as well. I spoke with Barai Siddiq Ali, governor of the central bank, who described an economy in freefall. The healthcare system throughout the country is almost completely collapsed. Village after village has been burnt to the ground, particularly in Darfur. Everywhere, marauding militiamen rape and loot with impunity. And then, to top it all off, is the famine.
When we spoke on the show about this about 6 weeks ago, I think famine hadn't yet been declared. So how bad is it becoming?
So the UN did declare, finally, a famine, but in a specific area, a camp for refugees in Al-Fashir, the capital of Darfur. But without doubt, it is far more widespread. Some estimates suggest hunger and related diseases will kill more than 2 million people by the end of September. The think tank behind these estimates has also extended its projections to over a 2-year time frame. And assuming a better harvest than last year, they say there may be 6 million excess deaths by 2027. But if the fighting continues until early next year, that figure rises to perhaps 10 million. So without decisive action, Sudan faces mass starvation at a magnitude not seen on the continent or frankly anywhere in decades.
Tom, where on earth do we go from here? How might this end?
The longer this war continues, I think that the greater the likelihood that the damage to the Sudanese state will be irreparable. I mean, we're looking at the possibility of Africa's third largest country essentially being cleaved in two, the so-called Libya scenario that diplomats worry about. And indeed, parallel states are beginning to emerge in areas under its control. The RSF is establishing its own bureaucracy, complete with civilian governors and a system for registering international NGOs. And there are about 4 different kind of zones of control throughout the country. It's not even just the RSF and the SAF at this point. It's far more fragmented than that. And just to say, on top of all of that, there's the problem of foreign powers meddling. Many observers now say Sudan's civil war is a proxy war, with powers like the United Arab Emirates in particular arming the RSF and fueling the conflict even further. So as it currently stands, the prospects for resolution do not seem any brighter than they did when the last time we spoke a couple of months ago. They might even be worse.
Tom, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you, Rosie.
Stray dogs have been a fixture of Turkey's cities for centuries. Butchers ply them with scraps, pensioners offer them water, others build boxes fitted with blankets to shield them from the winter cold. The strays are chipped, vaccinated, and spayed by local vets before being returned to the neighborhoods where they roam.
Piotr Zalewski is The Economist Turkey correspondent.
A few of them have even been honored with statues. One became a local celebrity and a social media sensation when he began touring Istanbul by metro and ferry. Now, the strays are poised to disappear. A law drawn up by the ruling Justice and Development AK party and passed by Parliament on July 30th requires municipal authorities to round up Turkey's street dogs and keep them locked up in shelters. Aggressive or terminally sick dogs would be put down. And even this is an improvement on an earlier proposal, which probably would have seen most strays put to death. Recently, I visited an animal clinic in Kemerburgaz, which is a suburb of Istanbul, on the way to the city's gargantuan international airport. This is a relatively modern, state-of-the-art animal clinic, which receives about 20 sick or injured street dogs per day, in addition to even more injured stray cats. For years, the vets at the clinic would nurse the dogs back to health and return them to the neighborhoods where they reside. From now on, though, dogs in the clinic's care will have to remain penned up unless they are adopted. In fact, a day before the new law entered into force, the clinic released many of its dogs so as to free up space for new ones. The new law gives Turkey's municipalities until 2028, or 5 years, to build enough new shelters for the country's estimated 4 million strays. The trouble is, at the moment, the total capacity of shelters across the entire country is only 105,000. Now, modern shelters like the one in Kemerburgaz may be able to cope with the influx of new dogs, at least in the short term, or so say the local vets. But the trouble is at clinics or dog shelters in poorer parts of the country where conditions are worse and room scarce. These shelters are woefully underprepared to receive new dogs and to keep them there. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his AK party frame this as the only solution to a dangerous menace, citing instances of children being mauled by stray dogs and dogs causing traffic accidents across the country. Animal rights activists, however, say that the measures will create shelters that are teeming with dogs and disease and ultimately pave the way for a mass call. There are unfortunately reports that killings of dogs have begun at least some shelters. There have been reports over the past weeks that dogs have been found buried in a grave outside one animal shelter, that they have been found poisoned elsewhere. This is not what the law calls for, but as animal rights activists fear, the law offers some clinics license to put down dogs who are not terminally sick or a danger to public health. This has, in turn, triggered a political standoff. The main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, or CHP, which runs the country's biggest cities, says it will not comply with the law. The country's main Kurdish party, which runs some parts of the country's southeast, has also said that its municipalities will not comply. On August 15th, the CHP, the main opposition party, applied to the Constitutional Court to have the law overturned. Turkey's dogs have been here before. In 1910, the Young Turks, who ruled the Ottoman Empire at the time, in their zeal to modernize the crumbling state, dumped tens of thousands of Istanbul's strays, deemed a nuisance and a symbol of the empire's backwardness, on Rocky Island near the city's shores. Mad with hunger, the dogs turned on each other and eventually starved, but not before keeping the city awake for weeks with their howling. Today's strays deserve better.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. Let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcast@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.